Hello kitty bats and welcome back to the channel. This is going to be a waistcoat tutorial. This is the piece I have on here. It's a semi-fitted style that buttons up the front and it has a V neckline. I developed my fitted bodice pattern to create this piece. I believe I made that 2 to 3 tutorials before this one, so if you haven't seen that already, I'm going to link it here and in the video description so you can watch that before you try out this project. This project is actually fairly simple to create. Once you have the patterns done, it's a case of assembling all the pieces that you've cut on your fabric, fit on your body, and then add your buttons and you're all done. I also added this bias taping detail on the front along the princess seam just to add a bit of personality to the front of the waistcoat. You can skip that however if you don't want to, but I really like how it just makes the front, I don't know, more dramatic, and I'm so down for that. If you guys would like to see how I made the patterns, how I cut and stitched everything together, make sure to keep on watching. Give this video a thumb up if you enjoy it, and without further ado, let's jump straight into the video. I'm going to be working with the following materials to create this waistcoat. I am going to be working with this beautiful red, yellow and black Ankara print, and I have a meter of that. To work with this as well, I also have these 3 buttons that I think really pick up the yellow shades really nicely. I also have a plain black cotton lining to help me finish it up on the inside, and then a bias tape which I'm going to be using to accentuate the princess seam on the front of the waistcoat. As I mentioned earlier on, I'm going to be working from my fitted bodice pattern, which I have done, I believe, 2 tutorials back that I'm going to link on the screen and down below, so please check that out because that's what I'm going to be working from as my foundation for this project. I have traced off the front and back, transferring my dots, annotation, grain line, notches, and this is what I'm going to be using to develop the waistcoat patterns for the front and the back of this design. Now, starting off with the front, I'm going to be making some changes on the front to have, the typical details that a waistcoat has. Now, to create the princess seam, I'm going to be connecting the 2 dots together with a curved line like so, and then I'm going to go to the bottom and draw a straight line. So by doing this, I have divided this front into 2 panels. Panel 1 and 2, and we're not going to be working with the dart along this side and the waist dart as well. I'm also going to go in to extend the center front edge by about 2.5 inches or 1 inch. This way I have a little bit of measurement for me to add my buttonholes and my buttons. I also want my waistcoat to have a V neckline, and I want the neckline to sit roughly 1 to 1.5 inches above my bust, so it's nice and modest but it's still deep enough to be noticeable as a V neckline that I'm going to draw back onto the shoulder. Along the hemline, I want to draw in a pointed detail that you would see in waistcoats or vests that have this shape. It can be pointed, it can be rounded, but I want the pointed shape. I'm going to go to the side seam and raise it by 1.5 inches, and then I'm going to come and draw in a shape that dips down around this area and comes back to the center front edge. Now, in between the center front edge and that line, I'm going to find the middle point and then mark 2 inches below that middle point. That is going to become the sharpest point of the new hemline that the front is going to have. So it's going to curve down towards that point and then back towards the center front edge, which is that 2.5 centimeter or 1 inch extension that we drew. Just going in here to extend that straight line like so we have a clear definition of the changes. The last thing I'm going to do to the front is I want the shoulder to be 3.5 inches wide, so it's slightly narrower than the original plan. And because it's a sleeveless vest, I kind of think it looks more flattering when it's a little bit narrower than wider, except if you want a wide one. Now, with all those changes made, I'm going to be grabbing some pattern paper and I'm going to trace off the 2 panels for the front, add seam allowance to that, and then cut that out. I'm just going to add a notch here so when I'm connecting everything together, I have something that guides me. Now, on a separate piece of paper, I'm just transferring my new center front edge, the neckline, the shoulder, the arm curve, that middle seam where the dart used to be, but we're not using the dart anymore, as well as the hemline. I went ahead to add a 1 centimeter seam allowance around my pattern, my grain line annotations, as well as notches, and that is what that side of the pattern is looking like. I repeated the same thing for the other side of my front, and these are what the front patterns of my waistcoat look like so far. Moving on to the back patterns, I'm going to be making some changes like we did for the front, and to ensure that the shoulder seam of the front matches with that of the back, I'm just transferring how much I took away from the shoulder, and it was about 1 inch that I'm going to draw in to make the new back arm curve. I'm also going to be raising the waistline by 1.5 inches because we raised the front along the side, and you kind of want the front and the back to match along the side seam. So the back is that dimension now. I'm also going in to draw a seam that cuts through like so. This step is optional. I just kind of wanted a seam, so we have 2 panels for the back as well. I'm also going in here to add a notch, and then I'm going to have panel 3 and 4 for the back. These I'm going to trace off as separate pattern pieces like we did for the front. Add your seam allowance as well as grain line and annotations and notches. That middle back piece is going to be cut on a fold, and then the side piece will be cut as 2 separate pieces, one to go on the left and one to go on the right hand side. If you want to have yours as one piece, you can just have it as one piece and then stitch your darts away without having the 2 separate panels like I have here for the back. Now these are all of the pieces I ended up with for the waistcoat, 2 for the front and 2 for the back, and I'm essentially going to use the same pattern to cut the main outer shell and the lining as well, so that way I don't need to create like fresh patterns for the lining. I'm going to go ahead to prepare my fabric, press it nice and flat, pin my patterns onto my fabric as well, and then I'm going to be going in to cut out all the pieces I need for my front and my back in the Ankara print as well as the cotton lining. After cutting out all of my panels, I made sure to transfer my notches, the ones around the bust, the waist, and those pivotal ones we added at notched points, so that way when I'm sewing everything together, it makes the job a lot easier for me. Now I'm going to start off by joining up the panels for the front and the back, and I'm going to put right sides together of my front panels, and I've just done this with some pins. And one thing I would say about joining curved seams is you have to ease 2 curved edges together, which can seem a bit tricky, but I would say having them pinned before sewing would make the job of just stretching out both ends so they fit accordingly as you sew. That way you divide the excess across the entire seam and you don't end up with any pucker or any gather at a point that you don't want it. I repeated the same thing for the front and the back panels, and this is what they're looking like. I gave the seams a press, and I'm just going in here to put right sides together, and I'm going to be sewing up the shoulder seam, joining the front and the back. This I'm going to do for this outer Ankara set, and then I'm going to actually repeat the same thing on my lining. So I'm going to join my lining front panels, the back panels, as well as the shoulder seam, so I'm ready to connect them together. Now this is one of the best ways to finish off sleeveless armholes, and basically you want to sew with right sides facing each other, the armhole and then around the neckline before you connect the side seam. So taking this my machine, I'm sewing only 1 centimeter seam allowance. I'm sewing around the front, the back and down the other front neckline, and then I'm going to go ahead and sew around both arm curves so I have that part of the waistcoat finished nicely. With that all done, I'm going to turn the piece inside out. So I'm going to pull out and reveal the right side of the waistcoat, and once that has been done, you should end up with something that looks like this. Now to connect the side seam, you would pick up the very bottom of your arm curve or your armhole, and then you put right sides facing each other of the Ankara side and the lining. So you want to join it in such a way that with one continuous stitch you can sew the side seam of the lining and the main body of your piece together. This technique you can use for tops, for dresses, for jackets that are essentially sleeveless, and I think it just makes a very clean and beautiful finish when you're all done, because you don't see any raw seams along the inside or the outside of your garment. Now I'm just stitching up this edge like so, and I'm going to go ahead and repeat the same thing on the other side of my waistcoat before coming back in to add my bias detail. I honestly feel like you could do the bias detail before joining the lining, whichever way you prefer to do it, it doesn't really matter. At this point I was like, okay, let me add this detail now because I think it would be really cool. And I'm going to be adding the bias tape along the princess seam on the outer shell alone, so that way I have the lining as its own piece and I'm not stitching through the lining, just on the outer shell. So this I'm going to take to my machine and I'm going to be sewing along the edges of the tape. So I'm going to be sewing one side first in a very narrow edge stitch, and then I'll come back and sew the other side, basically like how you sew a boning tunnel. That's the same way you would attach the bias tape. When you get to the end, you can fold in the end that goes, where your armhole is, so that way you have a nice, clean, beautiful finish there. This I did for the left and for the right hand side, and I'm just going in here to finish the hemline using bias tape. Now I'm going to finish this in 2 steps. I'm going to be sewing across this side of the hemline like so, and then I'm going to turn the bias tape into the wrong side of the garment, or the side where the lining is, and use that to close up and finish up the hemline. The beauty of bias tape is that they come already folded, so you don't need to think about if you're folding it enough or if you're folding it evenly. Essentially, I'm just going in to conceal the raw edge on the wrong side of the garment like so, folding in where necessary and sewing along the way on a very narrow edge stitch. When I get to the end of that seam, I'm going to do a reverse stitch. Now once that is all done, I am going to go ahead to finish up the waistcoat with buttons and buttonholes, and I've marked with my chalk the side where I'm going to be fixing my buttonholes, and I'm going to be sewing the buttons on the corresponding other side of this piece. My domestic sewing machine has a buttonhole setting which I'm going to be using. I've done a separate video showing how to do this on a domestic sewing machine. This is a Brother LS14, which I honestly love. And the final step to finish this waistcoat is essentially just to stitch the buttons in on the other side. I would say 3, 5 or 7 buttons are like a nice medium, just for visual appeal. It's just something that we do in fashion. However, it can be as playful as you would like. This is the piece all done. I honestly love the fact that it's not super tight on me, because I know I could easily layer jumper, dresses and other things underneath and it will still be comfortable to have on, and still it sits really nicely the way it is here. If you guys enjoyed this video, do let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. Please tag me if you recreate this on social media at Kimdave Designs, and I will see you in my next one. Bye.